Okay, I'm back. Let's start where we left off in this particular slide, the week 2 slideshow. And this is another quote from Mitchell's introduction. If the psychological task of the hero is to gain mastery, we looked at that one. But here's the third one. The more we try to fit Gilgamesh into the pattern of the archetypal hero journey, like he's the archetype, right? The form, the first and sort of paradigmatic example of the quest, right? The archetype of the journey story. The more we try to fit him into that pattern, the more bizarre, quirky, and postmodern it seems. I don't know if you agree with that, but it's an interesting interpretation. It's the original quest story, this is true, but it's also an anti-quest, since it undermines the quest myth from the beginning. So that's a claim. That's an example of a claim. You'd have to back that up with evidence from the text. And this is true of all of these quotations I'm showing you from Mitchell. I'm trying to get you to think about what's involved in giving a reading. You know, making a claim and then providing evidence from the text to support it. So what evidence do we see that the Gilgamesh poem undermines the myth of the quest or the archetypal journey myth from the very beginning? What are some of the ways that it does that? Or if you disagree with Mitchell, then you can provide evidence that it is a traditional and archetypal journey quest story, that it's that it shares everything with that archetypal pattern. So okay, that's just an example of a claim, and sort of how would you find support for that claim or in the text. And this is the last one. I'll let you work through this on your own. You can read this quote on your own. But again, it's an interesting claim about Gilgamesh and Enkidu, and Gilgamesh's experience of intimacy, and comparing that to Enkidu's experience of sex. And I like the last sentence. Unwittingly, each gave up part of his psychological strength in order to know the kind of love that an animal or a god can't know. Right? Is that how you're reading the relationship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu? Right? Do they achieve a kind of love that is not really possible for the animals, and that is not really possible for the gods? Right? That's one way of reading this story. Right? What is distinctive of the human is its capacity for love. Okay, I don't know. So shifting now to Genesis, and we've talked about the historical context of Gilgamesh and the poetic structure of Gilgamesh, the thematic structure. I've shown you some, we've raised some questions, I've shown you some quotations from Mitchell's introduction to the poem that gives a kind of interpretation, gives a reading of it. But let's now shift to the historical context of Genesis, and we're reading these two texts together. This is a picture of a timeline. So to the left, at the very bottom, it goes to around 1600 BC. But if you see the references to Moses in Exodus are supposed to take us back to around 1400 BC, right? And that is the beginning of the oral tradition of this tale that we see in the Torah, right? The Torah is the name of the Hebrew Bible, right? The first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. So the Pentateuch, that's a Latin word for 5. Right? Genesis is the first, that's what we're reading. Exodus, and that's where we encounter Moses, right? And so Moses in the story is the one who is sort of writing this down. Okay, so that's the story within a story, that Moses has written this down for us. And so Moses is supposed to have lived around 1400 BC. And then there is Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. Those are the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible called the Torah. And so this is a hypothesis here from Graf and Wellhausen. These are German scholars who came up with this hypothesis for the how to understand the origin and the structure and the history of the text. Right? So it begins not as a written text, right? So if you see that line in the middle, oral, it begins as an oral tradition going back to around 1400 BC, right? It's maybe earlier, okay? But notice that, so Sinuleke-Un was a scribe living in Babylon around this time, okay? And the oral tradition of Gilgamesh dates to much earlier than 1400 BC. But so around the time, around 900, we see we have the sort of first written sources of this oral tradition, starting in the north of what is now Israel, the northern tradition. We have rabbis who are writing down in ancient Hebrew the first few books of the Bible as we know it, although at this stage, around 900, it's not complete. The J of the northern tradition refers to the name that God is given in the text, Yahweh. And so, and here we have the names of some of the kings who are written about in these stories. So Solomon and David, right, are supposed to have ruled around 900. They ruled around 900 BC. So these are the stories of some of the kings. The written Hebrew language then dates back to around 900, right, around the time of the rule of Samuel. And around the same time in the south of what is now Israel, we have a different tradition, a different set of texts written by a different group of rabbis. And the reason it's called the E text is because God's name is Elohim. I'm bad at pronouncing the Hebrew word, but it's a different name for God, right? So the northern tradition is called the J text because God goes by the name of Yahweh. In the southern tradition, God goes by a different name. But these are rabbis writing down the stories from these same oral traditions, okay? And so that begins around 700, around the time of the fall of the northern kingdom, okay? And then, as you can see, the third major text is P, the priestly text. And this is, again, written by priests living in Babylon, because around 600, Jerusalem is overtaken, and the Jews are living in exile. They're forced out of Jerusalem, and they end up living in exile in Babylon around 600. And this is the beginning of the priestly text, right? So the rabbis are writing down these stories in Babylon and sort of pulling together all of these different oral traditions. Okay, but so this is at the same time we have this is the end of the kind of the northern text, right? But we continue to have rabbis writing texts using this name. But so there's three different traditions that all come together around 400 BC, right? All of these texts, the J text, the E text, and the priestly text are combined, and the Deuteronomy text, the Deuteronomist text, they're all combined into one sort of standard Torah, standard Hebrew Bible around 400. But you can see it's sort of put together from different traditions in different regions of Israel. And in the case of the priestly text, it's coming out of Babylon, Mesopotamia. And so by the time we get to 400, the restoration of the temple, the Jews return to Jerusalem, and we have one standard text of the Bible. Okay. Okay, so that's a hypothesis based on what we know from ancient texts that have been discovered and other writings and traditions, right? That's the best hypothesis for how the Bible as we know it in the Hebrew came to be put together. So it's, again, similar to Gilgamesh, a series of fragments based on an oral tradition that then get combined into one standard text. Okay, good. We're going to move more quickly now. We still have some time. The form of Genesis, structure of the writing is interesting, right? The word parataxis describes a system of writing in which parallel clauses are linked by and. And this is what you see in biblical writing. It's this happened, and this happened, and that happened, and everything is linked by the word and in the ancient Hebrew. So it's called the Alter, the translator of Genesis that we're reading. He calls parataxis the essential literary vehicle of biblical narrative, right? This is the way the ancient Hebrew writers saw the world, as ordered events linked by and. Okay. It's an interesting sort of fact about the form and the structure of the text and how the ancient Hebrew rabbis wrote the story. It's how they saw the world, right? Ordered events linked by and. Genesis is a book. So this has already come out in the slide I already showed you, right? This is a quote from Alter. 2 centuries of biblical scholarship have generally assumed that Genesis, and indeed most biblical texts, so, Exodus, Leviticus, is not strictly speaking a book, but rather an accretion of sundry traditions. Right? When we think of a book, we think of like one author sitting down and writing it and then publishing it, right? Certainly it's not how we can think of Gilgamesh, right? We don't know who wrote Gilgamesh. We have the standard version of Senelech-Un from 1100 BC in Babylon, but he's not the original author of the story. There's many versions of it before him and after him. But anyway, Genesis is not strictly speaking a book, but rather an accretion of sundry traditions shot through with disjunctions and contradictions and accumulated in an uneven editorial process over several centuries. So it took hundreds of years for the Bible to be in the form that it is now. And that process, right, was different traditions of writers working in different places. And so the text has contradictions, it has disjunctions, it has, things are put together in uneven ways. It was constantly being edited and worked over and redone and rewritten. Okay, that process has sort of ended. Now we have the sort of standard version of the Bible. We continue to have rabbis interpreting it and giving commentary on it. So if you look at the Jewish tradition, there's the Bible and there's also all the commentary on the Bible, and that's an ongoing tradition. Okay. Structure. We have a few minutes left. Okay. Structure. The first 11 chapters are called the primeval history. So narrative structure, like the story, the structure of the story. We begin with the universal perspective, like seeing the world from the point of view of the creator, right? So the origins of the world, right? The origin of the vegetable and animal kingdom, the origin of humankind, and then the origin of all known peoples from Greece to Africa to Mesopotamia, Asia Minor, which is Turkey, and that region. And then the origin of the primary institutions of civilization. Right? This is how the writers and the original readers see the opening 11 chapters as telling the kind of, from a universal perspective, the primeval history of the natural world and the social world, okay, of mankind. Then in chapter 12, Yahweh speaks directly to Abraham and things change. We focus now on a family, Abraham's family, and the beginning of a nation. It's a focus on the nation of Israel. And there is now sort of the intricacies and moral depth, right? Because we're encountering the everyday life of people. It's not there in the primeval history, like Adam and Eve. We're not in the sort of everyday life of a typical family. It's a very different perspective. But when we meet Abraham, there's kind of moral and psychological depth, and there's a focus on the nation, the beginning of the Israelite nation. So just quickly, thematic structure, creation, there's 2 of them. Think about the difference between creation in chapter 1 and creation in chapter 2. They're very different. We're in the garden, then Adam, and then out of Adam, Eve, the encounter with the serpent and the tree of knowledge, and then God's curse. You can think about the relationship between Adam and Eve and compare it to the relationship between Enkidu and Shamhat. We talked about that a little bit. But you can also look at the creation of, the creation moment of Ururu and compare it to the creation moment in Genesis, where Ururu makes Enkidu. How is that dissimilar to the creation of Adam, of the human? We have the curse, right? There's the curse of Humbaba on Enkidu. Okay, there's also a curse, obviously, in Genesis, right? God's curse on the human. And then as they're leaving the garden, right, we have an image of the tree of life, which is presumably what God is trying to protect against, right? Doesn't want the human to encounter that, to eat from that, because if the human eats from the tree of life, the human will be immortal. Okay, we're running out of time. The remaining slides are pictures of the sons of Noah and their nations and the journeys of the patriarchs. Okay, so we can talk about that another time. Okay, hope that was useful.